The sound of laughter echoed through the marble hallway of the mansion. But it wasn't the kind that brought joy. It was cruel, mocking, and it cut through Emma's heart like shattered glass as she knelt on the pristine white floor, her 7-month pregnant belly making the position almost unbearable, while above her stood Vanessa, her husband's mistress. One designer heel pressed lightly but deliberately on the hem of Emma's dress, holding her in place like a captured butterfly. Emma Chen had once been the brightest architect in the city, a woman who designed skyscrapers that touched the clouds. But here she was, reduced to this humiliating moment in her own home, the home she had helped Richard build with her inheritance, her love, and her dreams, now watching as he sat on the leather sofa just 10 feet away, not even bothering to look up from his phone, while Vanessa smirked down at her, making comments about how clumsy Emma had become, how she had accidentally dropped Vanessa's purse and was now properly apologizing for it. The irony wasn't lost on Emma. She had met Richard at a charity gala 5 years ago, when she was at the peak of her career, and he had been a struggling entrepreneur with big dreams and empty pockets. And she had believed in him, invested her family money in his tech startup, stood by him through every failure and sleepless night. And when his company finally went public 2 years ago, making him a millionaire many times over, she thought their struggles were over, that they could finally enjoy the life they had built together. But instead, Richard had changed, surrounded himself with people who measured worth by zeros in bank accounts, and 6 months ago, Vanessa Hartwell had walked into their lives, a social media influencer with 2 million followers, a woman who represented everything Emma was not: loud, flashy, demanding, and utterly shameless. The pregnancy had been Emma's last hope to save their marriage, a child they had planned for years. But Richard had grown colder, more distant, spending nights at business dinners that Emma knew were anything but. And then 3 weeks ago, he had done the unthinkable. He had brought Vanessa to their home, introduced her as his close associate, and expected Emma to accept this arrangement, to play the dutiful wife while he paraded his mistress through rooms that still held their wedding photos on the walls. Emma's hands trembled against the cold marble as she tried to rise, but Vanessa pressed down harder, not enough to hurt, but enough to humiliate. And Richard finally glanced up, his eyes empty of the love that once resided there, and said in a bored tone, "Emma, stop being dramatic. Just apologize properly and get up." As if she were a child being scolded, rather than his pregnant wife being degraded in her own home. The baby kicked inside her, a flutter of life that reminded Emma she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. But before she could speak, before she could summon the strength to either comply or rebel, the front door opened with such force that it slammed against the wall, and a voice that Emma hadn't heard in 6 months rang out, clear and sharp as a bell. "What the hell is going on here?" James Chen stood in the doorway, and even though Emma couldn't see him from her position on the floor, she would recognize her older brother's voice anywhere. The voice that had read her bedtime stories when their parents worked late, that had cheered at her college graduation, that had walked her down the aisle when their father's health had kept him from the honor, and the voice she hadn't heard since a stupid argument about Richard's treatment of her had driven a wedge between them 6 months ago. The pressure on her dress disappeared instantly as Vanessa stepped back, and Emma looked up to see James striding across the marble floor, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure in his perfectly tailored suit, still wearing his CEO badge from Chen Technologies, the billion-dollar corporation their father had built and James now ran, his face a mixture of shock, fury, and heartbreak as he took in the scene, his pregnant sister on the floor, a strange woman standing over her, and Richard lounging on the sofa as if nothing was wrong. "James," Emma whispered, and her voice cracked. All the strength she had been hoarding for months suddenly crumbling at the sight of her big brother, the one person who had always protected her, always believed in her, always stood in her corner. And she realized how much she had missed him, how much she had needed him, and how foolish her pride had been to push him away when he had tried to warn her about the changes he saw in Richard. James dropped to his knees beside Emma, his hands gentle as he helped her up, his eyes scanning her face, her swollen belly, the exhaustion and defeat written in every line of her body, and she saw something break inside him. Saw the big brother who had once punched a kid for pulling her hair in 3rd grade, struggling to maintain his composure. "Who are you?" James asked Vanessa, his voice deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that executives in boardrooms knew meant someone was about to be destroyed. And Vanessa, for all her bravado, took another step back, suddenly aware that the balance of power in the room had shifted dramatically, that the man before her wasn't some employee she could dismiss, or some social media follower she could block. He was James Chen, whose name carried weight in every business circle in the country, whose company's valuation was 50 times what Richard's startup could ever dream of being. Richard finally stood up, but there was nervousness in his movements now, and he said, "James, this is a private matter between me and my wife. You have no right to just barge in here." But his voice lacked conviction because he knew, they all knew, that this house, this beautiful mansion with its marble floors and designer furniture, had been purchased with Emma's family money, that the company he was so proud of had been built with Chen investment, and standing before him was the man who could make or break his entire empire with one phone call. "No right?" James repeated, and he laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "I have every right, Richard, because Emma is my sister, my family, my blood, and when I can't reach her for 3 weeks, when her assistant tells me she's stopped coming to her own architecture firm, when I finally get worried enough to use my emergency key to check on her, I find this." His hand swept across the scene, encompassing the humiliation, the disrespect, the casual cruelty of what had been happening, and Emma saw Richard flinch, saw Vanessa edge toward the door, saw the whole carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. Emma found her voice, found some remnant of the strong woman she used to be, and said quietly, "James, you didn't have to come." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie, knew that she had been drowning and he had arrived just in time to pull her to the surface. And when James turned to look at her, his eyes were filled with such love and concern that she felt tears streaming down her face. All the tears she had been holding back for months, all the pain and loneliness and fear, finally breaking through the dam. "Emma," James said softly, "I always have to come. I'm your brother. That's what family does." And then he turned back to Richard, and his voice changed, became the voice of the CEO who had negotiated billion-dollar deals and faced down corporate raiders. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sit down and listen, and your guest is going to leave now." Vanessa looked at Richard, waiting for him to defend her, to stand up to James. But Richard's face had gone pale, and he nodded at her, a slight jerk of his head toward the door, and Emma saw the exact moment Vanessa realized she was disposable, that whatever power she thought she had was an illusion, that Richard would throw her aside the moment someone more powerful entered the room, and there was almost something pitiful about how quickly she grabbed her purse and fled, her heels clicking rapidly across the marble until the front door closed behind her. The silence that followed was deafening, and James guided Emma to a chair, making sure she was comfortable before he turned his full attention to Richard, and Emma watched her husband shrink under her brother's gaze. Saw the man who had been so cold and cruel just minutes ago, reduced to fidgeting with his watch, unable to meet James's eyes. "How long has this been going on?" James asked, and Richard mumbled something inaudible, and James slammed his hand on the table, not violently but firmly. "How long have you been humiliating my sister, disrespecting the mother of your child, dishonoring the woman who believed in you when you had nothing?" The words hung in the air, and Richard finally met James's gaze, and Emma saw something flicker there, shame, perhaps, or maybe just fear of losing everything he had gained, and he said, "You don't understand the pressure I've been under, the expectations, the stress of maintaining this lifestyle, and Emma almost laughed at the absurdity of it, that he was trying to justify his cruelty with stress, as if she hadn't been under pressure too, as if carrying his child and watching her marriage dissolve wasn't stressful, as if being humiliated in her own home was somehow easier than whatever challenges he faced at the office. But James didn't laugh. He just looked at Richard with something like pity and said, "You had everything, Richard. You had a brilliant, beautiful wife who loved you, who invested her inheritance in your dreams, who stood by you when everyone else said you'd fail. You had a family that welcomed you, supported you, believed in you, and you traded it all for what? For ego, for some illusion of power, for the attention of someone who ran away the moment things got uncomfortable." The truth of those words seemed to hit Richard like a physical blow, and he sank back onto the sofa, his head in his hands. And for the first time in months, Emma saw the man she had married, the vulnerable, dreaming man who had once recited poetry to her under the stars and promised to love her forever. But she also knew that man had made choices, had allowed success to corrupt him, had chosen cruelty over compassion, and she didn't know if he could ever find his way back. James knelt beside Emma again, taking her hands in his, and said, "I'm so sorry. I should have tried harder to reach you. Should have broken down the door weeks ago. I let my pride get in the way when we argued, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and I need you to know something. You are not alone. You will never be alone. You have family. You have resources. You have options, and you never, ever have to accept treatment like this." Emma looked at her brother, really looked at him, and saw the guilt he carried for their estrangement, the fear that he had almost lost her, the determination to make things right. And she squeezed his hands and said, "I pushed you away, James. I was so determined to make my marriage work, to prove that I had made the right choice, that I couldn't admit things were falling apart. I couldn't face the reality that the man I loved had become someone I didn't recognize." James shook his head. "You don't have to explain. You don't have to justify. You just have to decide, what do you want to happen now?" It was the question Emma had been avoiding for months, the choice she had been too afraid to make. But sitting there, with her brother beside her and her baby moving inside her, she finally knew the answer, finally found the strength that had been buried under layers of hope and denial and misplaced loyalty. "I want my dignity back," Emma said clearly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I want my child to grow up knowing their mother is strong, that she knows her worth, that she never accepted being treated as less than she is. I want to remember who I was before all this, the architect, the designer, the woman who built beautiful things and believed in her own vision." She turned to Richard, who was watching her with red-rimmed eyes, and she felt a strange mixture of emotions: grief for what they had lost, anger at what he had done, but also a clarity she hadn't felt in years. "Richard, I loved you. I truly did. I gave you everything I had, and maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I gave so much that I forgot to save some for myself. But I can't do this anymore. I can't live in a home where I'm not respected, where our child would grow up watching their father treat their mother like she's disposable. I deserve better. Our baby deserves better." Richard looked up, and tears were streaming down his face now, and he said, "Emma, please. I'm sorry. I got lost. I let the money and the success change me. I forgot what was important, but I can change. I can be better. Please don't give up on us." And Emma heard the desperation in his voice, saw that he meant it in this moment, but she also knew that meaning it in a moment of consequence wasn't the same as meaning it in all the quiet moments that made up a life. That real change required more than words spoken in fear of loss. "Maybe you can change," Emma said softly. "Maybe you'll become the man I thought you were again, and if you do, I'll be happy for you. Not because I'll be there to see it, but because our child deserves a father who is good and kind and strong." "But Richard, I can't wait around to find out. I can't sacrifice my dignity and my peace, hoping you'll rediscover your humanity. I have to choose myself now. I have to choose our baby. I have to choose the life I want to build, not the one I'm trying to salvage from ruins." The words were final, a door closing on one chapter and opening to another, and Emma felt James's hand squeeze hers in support. Felt the weight of decision lift from her shoulders. Felt the first breath of freedom after months of suffocation. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers and logistics, of moving back to her family home where her father, recovered from his illness, welcomed her with open arms and tears of joy, of returning to her architecture firm where her partners had kept her office exactly as she left it, believing she would come back when she was ready, of James showing up every Sunday with takeout and terrible jokes, slowly rebuilding the sibling bond they had almost lost to pride and circumstance. Emma threw herself into work, designing a new community center for underprivileged youth, pouring her pain and hope into clean lines and soaring spaces, creating beauty from brokenness. And as her belly grew and her baby's kicks became stronger, she felt herself healing, felt her confidence returning, felt the architect, the creator, the dreamer coming back to life. Richard kept his distance but sent letters, pages and pages of apologies and promises and reflections on his failures, and Emma read them all, not because she was reconsidering but because she wanted to understand, wanted to see if his remorse was real or just fear of consequence. And as the months passed, she began to see genuine change, began to hear about him in therapy, attending support groups, dismantling the toxic circles he had built around himself. And while she didn't re-give him her heart, she felt the anger softening into something like forgiveness, not for his sake but for her own, because carrying hatred was exhausting, and she needed all her energy for the new life she was building. When Emma went into labor on a rainy Tuesday evening, James was there, holding her hand and nearly passing out twice, and when her daughter was born, a beautiful, healthy girl with Emma's eyes and a cry that could wake the dead, Emma felt a love so profound it seemed to remake the world, seemed to wash away every hurt and replace it with purpose, with joy, with an unshakable knowing that she had made the right choice, that her daughter would grow up in a home filled with respect and love and strength. She named her daughter Lily, after her grandmother, a woman who had fled war and built a life with nothing but courage and determination. And as Emma held Lily in her arms, with James taking approximately 3,000 photos and her father crying happy tears in the corner, she made a silent promise that her daughter would never see her mother accept less than she deserved, would grow up knowing that true wealth wasn't measured in mansions or bank accounts, but in dignity, in kindness, in the courage to choose yourself when the world says you should settle. 6 months later, Emma's community center design won a National Architecture Award, and at the ceremony, she stood on stage with Lily in her arms, looking out at the crowd, and spoke not just about design principles, but about the importance of creating spaces where people felt valued, where dignity was built into every corner, where beauty served purpose, and purpose created beauty, and her words resonated far beyond the architecture community. Went viral on social media, reached millions who saw in her story their own struggles, their own need to choose themselves, their own journey from brokenness to strength. Richard reached out to congratulate her, and they met for coffee, a brief, cordial conversation where he held his daughter for the first time and wept, where he told Emma about the work he was doing on himself, about the therapist who was helping him understand how success had corrupted his values, about the steps he was taking to become a man worthy of being Lily's father. And Emma listened with compassion, but also with boundaries, making clear that while she wanted him to have a relationship with their daughter, their marriage was over, that some things, once broken, couldn't be restored to their original form, but might, with time and care, become something different, something based on mutual respect and shared commitment to their child, rather than romantic love. As Emma drove home that evening, Lily sleeping peacefully in her car seat, She thought about how far she had come from that moment on the marble floor, how close she had been to losing herself completely, and how her brother's intervention had been the catalyst she needed, but that the real work, the real courage, had come from within, from her decision to value herself, to choose dignity over comfort, to walk away from a life that looked perfect but felt like dying. She pulled into the driveway of her new home, a beautiful brownstone she had purchased with her own money, designed with her own vision, and as she carried Lily inside, past the walls covered in her architectural drawings and family photos, and her daughter's first attempts at art, Emma felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt at home, not just in a place, but in herself, in her choices, in her life. And she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the strength of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken, refined, remade, and finally, beautifully, free. The marble floor where she had once knelt was far behind her, replaced by the solid ground of self-respect beneath her feet, and every step forward was a choice, a declaration, a promise to herself and her daughter that they would build a life not on the foundation of someone else's approval, but on the bedrock of their own worth, their own courage, their own unshakable knowledge that they were enough, had always been enough, and would always be enough.